dedicated to all the soldiers on their missions and their tasks, sacrificing, putting their lives on the line, their bodies on the line for Klal Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, Am Yisrael, and they should be successful in destroying Hamas and rescuing the hostages and return safely. And with the hostages' safety, or hostages must also be safe. And special mention for Yonatan Ben Meirav, Eitan Stern, Yishai Stern. What's your nephew's name?
Okay, so we're going to do it for two people. We're going to do it for friends of mine that I'm staying at, for Pam and Israel Goldberg. Their son is Shmuel David Ben Lever Yisrael, and my nephew's Gabriel Tzvi Ben Ilan and Ilana, and all the soldiers and all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael, and the whole of Klal Yisrael. Actually, there's a lot of anti-Semitic backlash. So teach us, Kev.
Okay, so just going back to the Parsha Toldot, it said that Esav sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils. He was hungry, and it says here in the commentary in the Gerald Hirsch Chumash, which is this one here, is over 40 years old. There's some very good commentary. It says here, Esav despised the birthright. It says the spiritual inheritance of Abraham, which would normally have passed into the hands of Esav, was not worth to him as much as lentils. And like the true sensualist, this fickle and impulsive hunter readily sacrifices to the gratification of the moment that which to a man of nobler build would be of transcendent worth. So he probably thought it would come with certain responsibilities, and he didn't want to step up to the plate when necessary, and that's why he was involved in the physical world, hunting and killing and really physical pursuits. So he didn't want to be too spiritual. I mean, he was spiritual. We don't understand the level of these people, but so Rivka was probably right. She saw this, and obviously what she did was the right thing. It comes across as deception and deceit, but it had to be done that way in order for the Jewish world, to run its course as we know it today.
Good.
Yeah, on that, that's very good.
I just read the ad lib there, by the way.
Kevin, you must remember, Mama knows best.
Yeah. In this case, definitely, without a doubt.
Hey guys, let's just cover a little bit of ground. I'm sure you're all tired. So we're on the 114th daf. Just remember, 5 dafs away from the finishing line in the marathon. We're all a little tired, but thank God we're doing this. So in Bava Kamma, what you're seeing now is a repetition of the next half a daf on the 66th daf. Sometimes what they do is they don't repeat everything of exactly the same context. Otherwise, there's repetition is redundancy. So it's not redundancy when the application is different. You often find that they'll bring a daf in Kedushin, both in Kedushin and in Bava Kamma, but the context application is slightly different. There's no superfluous repetition. It's for a reason, because the application is different. So we said very simply, in the 26th daf of the 8th section of Kalim, in order for an object other than a person or food for that matter to become tameh, impure, through contact with the source of tumah, something that itself is infected with impurity, it's got to be classified as a kli, a utensil. Now we think of a utensil just as a kitchen utensil. It's not. A kli isn't just a utensil. It's something of utility, meaning it's not. It could be anything of value. In a certain way, a garment itself has utility. So in other words, what you've got is something fashioned into a useful form. And it's got to be designated for use in that form, meaning it's not only the fact that that object is useful, but it has to be used in that form. We learned, for example, in the laws of Shabbat, you can operate with a shinoi, meaning if you're not using it for its intended purpose, sometimes there are leniencies. But in any event, in this stuff, we say, look, there's a raw material that requires processing before it can be used as a utensil, and therefore it's not susceptible to tumah. But there are times when a raw material can be rendered a utensil, and obviously then it's susceptible to tumah by mere thought on part of its owner, without any processing. Let me give you an example. We said it yesterday. So there are two factors here. The one is further processing required, at which case no thought is sufficient. It has to be followed by a ma'aser, an action, in order to render it complete and useful. But there is an object that is in a process state. It just hasn't been applied as such. So, for example, I've got a hide of leather. And I use the hide of leather, and I put it down on my table, and I say this is going to be a placemat where I'm going to be eating, and therefore I've assigned utility of leather as a function for a kitchen table placemat. Now, was there any further processing that needed to be done? No, because a piece of leather can be the same as a table mat. However, or in fact a tablecloth, for example, if it's large enough. We are saying, though, that raw materials are different, because leather in those days, you need a mold. You need to put it into a shoe. You need to obviously create it wet enough and pliable enough to take the shape of a shoe, and heat it and chemically treat it where it keeps that particular position. Rubber soling, you need to stitch it, etc., etc. So, how does this relate? Before we say how it relates to a thief and a robber, all we said is that if you've got a piece of hide and in its present state, you've got the mindset, the machshava, the intent, to use it as a mat, that requires no further processing in that case. The intent alone immediately elevates the hide to a status of a utensil, and therefore it renders it susceptible to tumah. Now, there is an issue. So for example, you've got the mat, and then you drop it in a container by accident. You drop it, and that has had a dead sheretz in it, and then when you fish it out, it's got tumah. So we're saying there that when it's in its finished state, the only thing that you need to assign to it is definitive thought, and therefore the only person, this is where the daf is going to get to in the Mishnah and Bava Kamma, that can assign definitive thought is who, guys?
The end user.
Excellent. So it is the end user, meaning the owner, because the end user is going to be the owner. That's exactly right. So that is its logical conclusion. And in fact, it's as Gavin said, because if we look at the heart of a householder, so in other words, guys, let me just wait for the conversation to clear. You can't hear it on your side.
Yeah, we don't hear your background at all. We're very fortunate, but obviously it affects you.
All right. So basically, if as Gavin said, he owns the hide, and it's not going to a third party, his thought, his intent, can determine if it's a mat immediately. So therefore, he's got the realm of control because it's his. Whoever owns it, it's his. And therefore, the end user Gavin's referring to, quite rightly, is for example, the case where a guy has a tannery and a client comes to him, and in that particular case, he can't determine what the status is going to be of the leather. Why not? If I'm a tannery and I say I want it to be a mat and sell it in the shop, what would be the problem in doing that? Then we're going to go into how it relates to robbery and theft.
The problem with that is you don't know what the client actually wants to buy. He might want to buy a jacket and not a mat.
Exactly. So as Arthur said, it's all very well determining what you want the leather for, but you're not going to sell any items. And if you're a smart business person like Arthur is, what you do is you let the customer dictate what he wants to use the leather for before you can assign thought to it, because it's not your thought that matters. It's the thought of the customer, who's the end user, who's the owner. So what it's coming to here is, Gavin, at the end of the day, the owner itself determines the thought to take an item like a piece of leather and assign it to a mat at which no further processing occurs, and then it can be infected with tumor if it happens to touch tumor. So
Can
that's
I ask you an interesting question?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. It's quite an interesting question. If I'm pretty sure I know the answer. If the end user, right, takes it and he's had enough of it, right, and he sells it secondhand, all right. Now the secondhand owner, I presume it's his, whatever he intends using it for, because I'm presuming that it can change from a placemat to something else with a different end user. I presume that's the case. Am I right or not?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So whoever is the owner determines intent, because it's his object, it's his realm of control. Exactly.
Yeah, but I'm saying it can't hold on to the previous owner's intent. It's released.
It has to transfer, and this is what we're saying is what constitutes ownership: possession or legal entitlement. And this is where it's coming to, because if somebody steals or robs your item from you, okay, who has it? It's the thief or the robber. He actually has possession. So can he then claim the realm of control because it technically is in his control? Or is it from a legal standpoint or spiritual standpoint, the original owners in terms of realm of control? I'm asking you guys before.
So Dan, a quick thing I realized. Basically, what you're saying is you're in charge of your own hide.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's actually very good. Kevin, you should give a reaction there on your screen there.
I can't hide my pleasure from Arthur's analysis.
Arthur, I was trying to seek a better response, but I couldn't.
Very that's very cute.
So Damon, yeah. So you're saying, you're saying that the robber could say he possession, and he's the owner, but maybe then it should be based on the purchaser who actually gave monetary value and actually purchased the item. That's the actual owner, not based on possession.
No. Well,
like the robber's got.
It would be paid based on. It could only be on two factors. There's a legal and a moral implication. In other words, as far as a robber or thief is concerned, they actually have the item in their possession. So if they have if they've got a piece of leather that they stole, and no further processing is required, and they want to turn it into a placemat, can they turn it into a placemat because they have possession of it? Whether it's legal or illegal, they've got it. So is it susceptible to tumor if the intent is to turn it into a utensil, a placemat in this case where it's functional, and they accidentally put it on a infected area that is full of tumor? Because if it's just a piece of hide and they haven't assigned use, it won't contract tumor. It has to be assigned as a utensil. So in other words, the robber or thief, now that they've got it in their possession, is their intent to take a piece of leather and make it a placemat, enough that if they touch it with tumor, that placemat has tumor? Or do we say that just because they have possession, they don't have that control, and the original owner whom they stole it from is the only one that can have that intent, that cognitive thought of turning a leather hide into a placemat being a utensil, and therefore the susceptibility to tumor is there should it be infected.
So
Would
I would
that-
say
would that
possession.
depend on
Possession's fine.
would that depend on if the person was in despair already?
Excellent,
somebody's in
excellent.
despair.
So Arthur hit on the answer, is that what makes an object transfer from one to the other. So according to, there was a pasuk that said the person who stole, I'm paraphrasing, has to return what he stole. There was a double word there. And what did that imply? It wasn't superfluous, that it has to return the item in exactly the same condition that it was stolen. Meaning, if there's a physical change, so for example, I steal a piece of leather and I then make it into a shoe. Then I physically changed it. Physical change isn't enough without despair, without your ush, as Arthur said.
Yeah, without.
So at the point at which I've despaired of getting my piece of leather back and somebody else has taken it and turned it into a shoe, the despair combined with the physical change suffices to acquire ownership of that leather for the robber. And if you want to turn around and say, but the robber stole it, why should he keep it? He doesn't. If it ever comes to court, the robber or the thief has to pay the financial equivalent of cash to the original owner, but he gets to keep the item. And that's what's at play here, is that has Yu'ush taken place? Because if a thief or a robber has taken the object and Yu'ush despair has already taken place, then it belongs to the robber. And since it belongs to the robber, if he says that that piece of hide in his mind is a placemat and it touches tumah, it becomes tameh, it becomes impure. Because he's now the owner, because the despair from the original owner has relinquished acquisition and has now transferred ownership to the robber. Yes, he can be sued and have to pay the cash equivalent, but that hide is his. Now, that
can I
hide
ask
is
you
his.
something, Damon? Sorry,
Yeah,
one
sure,
second.
sure.
I don't quite get that. I don't understand why you have to be the owner, because okay, stealing's one thing, but if you, let's say I borrow a placemat from you, right? And I'll end up using it for something else. Surely whatever I intend using it for, even though I'm not the owner, is what that's for. So if you give it as a placemat and I decided to use it as a doormat, or something else, then surely it should be what I use it for, whatever the user uses it for. And also, I'm not going to necessarily know what you designated it at, neither will the thief. So surely whatever the thief designates it at should be fine without ownership. I don't understand why ownership has to take place in this particular issue.
Okay, so Gavin's asked a very good question. Surely, if Gavin borrows the object and uses it for whatever he uses it for, at that point, he's got control, and therefore, why should it have to do with the original owner? Let's just use the practical example before we get to an ethereal example like Tuma and Tara, because if you're looking at, it was a case where we learned in the beginning of Bava Kamma, there was Rav Oshia and Rav Chia, and we learned that there's something called perceptible damage and imperceptible damage, meaning I take wine and it turns to vinegar. There is actual damage to the physical quality of the wine that any non-Jew or Jew that's secular could determine. There's a qualitative difference in terms of damage. Okay? Let's take that first duff. Okay, Gav? So in that case, for perceptible damage, if you have to leave my wine in the sun and it turns to vinegar, you're responsible because you damaged it. Okay? Because qualitatively now, it's no longer worth the value of wine, it's worth the value of vinegar. Okay. Now, it's different in the case of truma, of tuma, etc. So truma, only the Kohen can have it. Tuma is it's off bound. It's off bound. For usage because it's in.
Yeah.
What's that term?
Out of bounds.
Out of bounds. Out of bounds. Sorry, not off bounds. I'm off, and the term is out of
That's
bounds. Yeah. So it's out of bounds because you can't have something that's spiritually infected with impurity. But because there's no discernible difference in terms of qualitative nature, it is still one, and it hasn't reduced in quality. Are you liable or not? So there was Rav Chia and Rav Oshia, and some determined that the qualitative nature of the physical properties is the only thing that counts. The others consider the fact that a no-Jew can use it, and you have to sell it to a non-Jew as being an act of damage. So that's to address one of your questions. You had another question within there, and that is surely, and I'm bringing this up for a specific reason, Gavin, because if you have a piece of leather, and you lend it to me, and I have that piece of leather, and it gets damaged, it gets caught in a shredding machine because I'm trying to clean it during load shedding, and suddenly it chaps it, and out comes 10 pieces of leather, and it's all mangled. I'm responsible. I might borrow it, it might be yours, but my actions has led me to damage your product, even inadvertently, and therefore owe you. So what Gavin's saying is, surely the realm of responsibility could also lie not with the person that originally owned it, but the person that borrowed it. Is that what you're trying to ask, Gavin?
No. So what I'm saying is why do you have to have ownership to dictate what that? Surely the user dictates what's it called, what the purpose of the product is, not the owner. The owner, yes, if he's the user, but if he's not the user, if somebody else is the user, because you can also be the owner of a massive farm and you can have a whole lot of objects on there, and different people use it for different things. So I'm just saying, not the owner won't always assign what it is. It can be somebody else, because you can rent it out to somebody else and they can use it for a different purpose. Okay, no, that's different. That's
either way your question's answered, because the point of it is, let's just take the base principle. In its raw, unprocessed state, nothing becomes tuma, because it's not it doesn't have utility. Okay? So it doesn't matter if it's the original owner or a friend that borrowed it, or the fact that you bought it at the store and you're the new owner, and it did come from, doesn't matter. If in a raw state, nothing can become tuma. Once it's processed, whether the shop puts on a label and says, now you're buying a vacuum, that's a stupid example. Now you're buying a set of kitchenware, okay? And you buy it, and it says, you go to the kitchenware section in Macro, and you buy kitchenware. Now, if you want to use that kitchen knife, Gavin, to start pruning trees instead of cutting chickens, I don't care. You can use it for whatever you want. It's still susceptible to tuma because it has utility. The fact that you assign it for a different function doesn't take away the utility. Whether the shop says it's this item and it's to be used for kitchens, or whether you decide to use it to prune your roses, at that point it's processed. So as long as
I'm getting you. Yeah. So as soon as you've assigned it, then it's as if it has been processed, because you've assigned it.
So it doesn't matter if you're using it for a different tool. The point of it is either not susceptible to tuma because it's not a kli yet and it's in its raw state, or it is susceptible to tuma because it's got some function because you bought it or you borrowed it or something. So whether you use it for a completely different task, in other words, I had it as a placemat, and you suddenly want to do a puppet show for one of your young kids or nephews with a piece of leather as a mouthpiece, who cares? You've got utility out of it. If you drop it in a container of sherrits, it's infected.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Thank you. I didn't actually see it all the way through. Thank you.
So all we are saying here is, at the end of the day, we're learning two things from this Gemara. The first thing of it is, well, a very interesting lesson we learned in Kalim is that once it gets to the stage where no processing determines its utility, meaning in its current state, you can either say it hasn't reached utility yet because I want to turn it into a shoe and it requires further processing. Then even if it looks functional to somebody else as a mat, it doesn't matter. The person that owns it or the person that is going to buy it, whoever it's destined to go to, they determine the function. But the thing of it is, if you're already buying it at the shop, the minute it leaves the shop, you've bought it for a function, therefore it has utility. If you want further processing when you buy it at the shop, like at a tannery, to become a shoe, then you're only taking it at the point at which it has utility to you. That's all. And now the question's going to arise, well, who's responsible for the tumah? So in other words, we're saying if a robber steals something that doesn't belong to them, and they've damaged it by dropping it in an area that's infected with spiritual impurity, does this object, now that it's a completed utensil, get infected or not? Well, the question is, if it's obviously a finished object, yes, of course it gets tumah. The question only arises that it could be processed or unprocessed depending on the intent of the person that has possession just before they dropped tumah. In other words, if the robber takes a piece of leather and thinks, I'm going to make a tablecloth, does him thinking it's going to make a tablecloth, even though the original owner was going to keep that piece of leather, Gavin, to further process as a leather lounge suite and have upholsterers put cushions in it and build a frame? At that stage, according to the original owner, it's not susceptible to tumah because it's in an unprocessed raw state. It's not a kli yet. Doesn't have utility. But according to the robber who stole that piece of leather, just wants to cover his dining room table, and therefore for him it's a finished product in his mind. So do we say that if he contracts tumah with it accidentally, it takes the thought process of the robber, or do we say it takes the thought process of the original owner, who in his mind had it in a raw state for upholstery of furniture? So with this we can
I say the original owner, unless he's despaired, in despair.
Exactly. So
once
Arthur's
he's
right.
in despair, then it gets straight.
So Arthur, it depends if you're holding like the Mishnah now, or the Brisa, or the previous Mishnah. So the Tana Kamma of this Mishnah stated very, very clearly, and this is Gavin White's bringing it to the fore. We said, if you're a tax collector, not you, I don't want to say you because you're not a sinner. But no, he's not. So say you've got an illegal tax collector or customs collector. He takes Reuven's Porsche. Reuven says it's not fair. I don't know that much in taxes. It's ridiculous. And he kind of wants the guy to keep quiet, and he feels guilty, and he figures if he gives him another car, he's not really doing anything wrong. Then the tax collector gives this guy that had a Porsche, he gives him a Ford Escort. Then in that particular case, the Tana Kamma of this Mishnah says he can keep the Ford Escort because you can be assured that the original owner had despair of the Ford Escort, because he's not going to argue with the tax collector with 10 mafia henchmen, especially with authority of the king, although the king wouldn't be too happy. That's why we consider it stolen, because we know that he's not acting within the king's restraint of taxation levels. So accordingly, the Brisa brings a previous Mishnah, which we learned, which says, Yeush, despair in conjunction with either a financial transaction or a physical change of domicilium, a change of address, or a physical change to the property. The conjunction of despair with one of those three factors, a change of address, a change of money, or a change of physical properties, only both of those factors trigger a change of ownership from the original owner to the thief or the robber. Okay, in terms of don't worry, as I said, the robber thief, if he's caught, he has to pay cash equivalent, but he owns that object now, because according to the pasuk, since it's changed in that manner, it doesn't resemble the object he first had. So Arthur's right. In this case, the ush, according to our Mishnah, is enough, because our Mishnah is saying that we can assume that the owner of the Ford Escort despaired. The owner of the superior donkey got an inferior donkey, and the owner of the inferior donkey, originally who the tax collector collected it from, despaired, just like this one's despairing of his superior donkey. And therefore, since despair has occurred, it is transferred ownership where the third party can accept the inferior donkey as some form of compensation. And the Rashash and Rashi both said it's repugnant to keep an item that is stolen from another Jew, even though technically you can, because there's a transfer of ownership to the third party because of Yerush. The brisa that we learned contradicts that, and it brings a previous Mishnah that we learned before, that only Yerush in combination with either change of domicilium, address, a physical change, or a change of money, not all three, one of the three in conjunction with despair, triggers a change of ownership from the original owner to the robber or thief. So what the Gemara is going to ask is, what happens here? Does the thought render it belonging now to the thief or the robber? If there is Yerush, and what determines Yerush? So let's just go through it quickly. So we learned in a Mishnah in Kalim, in the case of hearts of a householder, thought renders them susceptible to tumah, because he's the master of his own house, and basically, guys, he can determine if something's raw, processed. If he sees a heart of leather, he can make it a tablecloth if he wants. But in the case of a heart of a tanner, he relies on the customer to tell him what to do with that heart, and therefore his thought about what it's going to become doesn't render them susceptible to tumah, because he can't predict what the customer wants the finished product to be. So it's saying in the case of a robber, thought does not render them susceptible to tumah. Let me explain what I mean. A robber in this case is one who takes a person's property from him openly by force. That's how he stole the hearts, okay? And we're saying in that particular case, thought does not render them susceptible to tumah, which obviously means, guys, that even though the robber designated the hearts for use, that requires no further processing. In other words, he sees a piece of leather, he says, I'm going to use it as a tablecloth. The reason they don't become susceptible to tumah is his intent of taking it from a raw article to process by thought alone, because it requires no further physical action of processing, cannot be rendered acceptable. Why? And therefore they don't become susceptible to tumah, because exactly as Arthur said, we know that the owner has not despaired of retrieving them, because we presume that if somebody robs you, we're not talking about a robber that uses a mask. We're talking about somebody, a big guy that you're at. Say you're at a school with a bigger guy, and the guy that's bigger than you says, I'm going to smack you unless you give me my your suitcase. Okay? He knows who the guy is. And therefore, in that case, he doesn't despair of getting it back, because he's going to go to the principal in break period and say, guys want me to do my homework. I can't. The class bully took my bag. Okay, he might get a crack afterwards, but the point of it is they'll call a parents-teacher meeting, they'll call the bigger kid and ask him for psychological evaluation, they'll put him on daily report. So because you see who's robbing you, you're not going to have this concept of Yerush despair of retrieving your bag as a school kid because you know you're going to get it back. So it's the same thing here. Since the victim knows who robbed him, he will sue the robber in court to retrieve the stolen goods. So the robber is not the legal owner of the hearts, and therefore his thought cannot render them susceptible to tumah. Okay? Now, so basically, but in the case of hearts of a thief, thought renders them susceptible to tumah. Why? Because since the owner didn't know who stole the hearts from him, we assume he despairs of recovering them because he didn't even know who robbed him. There was a tunnel in his house, his stuff's missing, and therefore the thief acquires them through despair, through Yush, as Arthur said. And as despair now has transferred ownership, even if the thief is eventually taken to court, the thief only has to pay the cash equivalent. Therefore, is now the legal owner of the hearts, and his thought can dictate their present state without further processing of assigning a heart to a mat, and therefore it's in a finished state according to his need of use, and renders them susceptible to tumah. Okay? All right, guys, I think we end on this note. I hope I've made it clear. Well done, guys. All of you.
Well done. You ended off on a high note. It wasn't a low note either. Well done.
Yeah. All right, guys, have a great night. Be well.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much. Good.